You may have seen some videos recently from creators selling LUT packs for OBS and for streaming to make your webcam or streaming camera look a certain way. They call it professional or cinematic or whatever. This has been plaguing YouTube content creators for years and years and has finally hit the streamers market. And I'm kind of disappointed because all they are glorified Instagram filters that apply effects that you really don't want to your camera. Like, do you really want your streaming camera for the entirety of your stream to look like this or this or this? No, probably not. LUTs or color lookup tables should be used to make your camera look better, to enhance it, to make it look the way you think it should look, not to apply an Instagram filter. And that's the problem with a lot of these videos and releases. So I want you to stop using them and instead learn to make your own, which I'm going to show you how to do in today's video, right after this. You know what? I do not have an ad for you today. Go subscribe on Floatplane or Patreon for early access to videos and behind the scenes content, and join us on Discord, EposVox.gg/Discord. Come chat with us. I'm EposVox, your stream professor, and welcome to a new episode of Stream Guides, wherein I'm showing you why and how to build your own LUT to make your webcam or your streaming camera look amazing instead of looking flat and boring and whatever. I'm going to walk you through what this is, how to do it in Resolve, Premiere Pro, and Photoshop, and how to implement it in OBS Studio, StreamLabs OBS, and in XSplit Broadcaster as well. We're going to shove it into this whole video because my original take was 40 minutes and I had to re-record the whole thing because the audio was missing. I love content creation sometimes. So, as I mentioned, a LUT is a color lookup table. It's basically a way to analyze and change colors within your video feed. It's used a lot in video production, video editing. It's used for previewing as well as for mastering. And now it's been supported in OBS Studio, StreamLabs OBS, and recently XSplit Broadcaster for a while. LUTs themselves, in relation to this context, are typically in a .cube or .png format. It does look like StreamLabs OBS now does support the .cube format, so XSplit is the only program in which you'll have to mess with the .png format. This will be relevant later. The first step before we can make a LUT is actually to record a sample clip of how your camera currently looks. You need to do a couple things first. You need to set up your camera. You need to set it to a custom white balance based on your current lighting that you plan on using for streaming. This is especially important if you're using a real camera, like a mirrorless, a DSLR, a camcorder, things like that. In order to do so, you need one of a few things. Either a gray card, these can be had for cheap on Amazon, which gives you either a white or a 50% gray point for white balance. I highly recommend using the 50% gray instead of white. You can get a full-on color checker or color chart. This is the X-Rite Color Checker Passport, which gives you color reference points as well as exposure levels. These are for exposure, and this also is used for white balance. Worst case scenario, you can use a white piece of paper, or even I have over here this white envelope. But this paper white is not the same as like quote unquote real white for video production, and you're gonna have a harder time getting it quite right with this. Step one is to use your video capture software to get the most lossless quality copy you possibly can. OBS in the simple output mode has a lossless mode. If you have dedicated capture software for your capture card, for example, I'm using my Blackmagic software to record one of my cameras here, that can get you a lossless quality copy. You need to set up a recording in your exact stream lighting and layout you plan on using, and hold up your gray card or color checker or whatever near your face, exactly where your face would be so that it's not getting blown out or anything, and just get a nice sample. Record for, say, 10 seconds. Save that recording, and we're gonna bring it into our video editors to actually build our LUT. Now I'm gonna start with DaVinci Resolve. It is available for free. It's an incredible software for color grading. It is my favorite way to color grade, but there are other options we're gonna cover, including Adobe Premiere Pro for those who prefer that workload, and Adobe Photoshop for those who are more familiar with photo editors. That way, hopefully we kind of cover everybody here. So let's jump in with DaVinci Resolve. So the first step is to bring in your color grading test into your favorite video editor and make a new timeline using that clip. And we're good to go. So we're using Resolve for this one. I've made a new timeline with that test clip, and I'm just gonna kind of find the point where I have my gray card up here. And then I'm gonna head on over at the bottom here to the color tab. This is DaVinci Resolve's color grading workflow. Yours may look ever so slightly different than mine, as I have some of the tabs selected here. So I have clips enabled. We'll need that in a little bit. I have nodes enabled. You can think of nodes kind of like layers. They are different steps along the color grading process, and they are going to be very important to optimizing this workflow for future changes. I'll talk about this later on in the video. And then I have the effects in the lightbox hidden. Over here, I do have gallery shown, as we will want that in a little bit. So here are the nodes. As I mentioned, you can think about them as layers. We're going to use one node for each step of the color grading process that we do. So I'm going to hit the keyboard shortcut Alt-S and make a bunch of different nodes, and then click back on the first one so that we can work with it. In the middle here, you have your preview. This is your video preview, and you can see the little circle with the stars, the little magic icon. This is what we will use to turn on and off the color grading so we can see a before and after and make sure it's looking how we want. So the first step that we want is to change our white balance. Now, I mentioned before, you need to go ahead and set a manual white balance in your camera. This can be done through the menus. Usually there's a white balance option, and it'll take a picture of the gray card that you have, and you center that, it'll take a picture of it and set the white balance based on that. We still want to set it in the LUT just in case there's any slight inaccuracies. We can kind of get the best of both worlds here. If you are on a webcam, however, you'll either want to set it to manual white balance if you can get it exactly kind of where you want it, or if you a lot of webcams really suck at manual white balance. If you can't get it quite right, then leave it on auto, let it normalize for a sec before you record your sample clip, and that will help you out to get more of inline white balance. It'll still be changing a little bit since it is on auto, but generally white balance in the webcams kind of settles on a consistent point, and once you capture that consistent point, you can work with it. So we're going to set our white balance based on this gray card. Now I'm going to click on the primary wheels tab here under the color controls. I also have the waveform enabled. If you don't see this at all, hit Control-Shift-W, and that will reveal the scopes here. And then click the drop down and choose waveform. Yours may pop up in a separate window. Mine does it in a panel. I'll explain how this works as we edit. But first and foremost, I'm going to click down here in the bottom left, this little eyedropper. This is for setting white balance, and bring it over a kind of evenly exposed part of your gray card. You can see here it gives you R, G, and B values. These are white balance values. These are the differences between the color readings for red, green, and blue. More or less, you want these to be even. Now, they are pretty much completely even across the board in mine because I had my white balance set in camera and it did a good job. But you can see here, if I go up here a little bit, there's a little bit more blue than red or green. And part of this is because you can see I have a little bit of a pink cast on my skin here. I forgot to turn off one of my colored lights that I have splashing on my wall in front of my face, which then splashes on my face. We're not going to correct for that because that would be silly. I should have just turned that off. But you can see here, we get a slight difference. There's a little bit more blue. So I click on that and that'll fix it. Again, in my instance, you're not going to notice a massive change. In your testing, you may actually have a much bigger change than I do. So we have white balance set. We're going to leave this first node as is. I'm not going to do anything else on this node. You can do all of your changes on one node, but I want you to set this up so that you can come back to it, tweak it later, make it better over time, or if you get a new camera or something and adjust it later, I'm going to show you how to do all that. And for that, we want everything on separate nodes. So I'm going to right click this first node and put node label and just call it white bal so that I know this one is my white balance. I'm going to click on the second node for us to make our exposure adjustments. And I'm going to go ahead and change that label to exposure. So now I'm going to use these wheels. You see lift, gamma, gain, offset. If you don't see that, you might be on one of these other two little dots. Click the first one. Now, this is fairly straightforward. We're not going to mess with offset at all. That's for just adjusting the overall levels of the video. We don't want to mess with that for this purpose. It'll mess things up. Lift, gamma, and gain are your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights. So the darker parts of your images, the shadows, the midtones are mostly your skin and like the evenly lit parts of the image. And then your highlights are the brightest parts of the image. Now, these are represented kind of here over here on the waveform. You can see here the very top line, this is clipping in white, which means it's just too bright. There's not enough information because it's all been blown out because the source was too bright. And then at the bottom, anything going below 0 will then clip in the black because it's just too dark and there's not enough information there. Keep that in mind. We'll want to work with this. Now, you can mostly tweak this by eye, and that's totally fine. However, if you do have one of those color checkers passports like I do, or one of the other color charts, these 3 bars, the white, the gray, and the black, actually help you with your exposure. You can see here over in the waveform, they're actually represented by 3 different bars. The shadows are kind of hard to see. They're kind of down here, but it's usually a red, green, and blue kind of right here. And you want to line them up so that the hottest is at this 896 number, the gray is at the 512 number, and then typically the darker one, the black one, should be around 128. Now, this isn't a hard science. Color grading is an art, but generally for proper exposure, that's kind of what you want to aim for. But if that starts not looking right, then you can tweak from there. So I can see My white's a little hot, so I'm gonna turn that down a little bit to evenly line it up with 896 a little bit better. My midtones are really low, so I'm gonna boost them up towards 512, and then I'm gonna bring my shadows back down, and I'm gonna get it so that some of the stuff is like slightly clipping, but maybe not too much. I'm gonna hit Control F to full screen this preview, see how it looks. Looks like I'm boosting my midtones a little too much. It's a little noisy in that background. I don't like that, so I'm gonna turn it down just a little. Maybe right about there. That's about where I want my image to look. Our exposure's set. We're done with this node. I'm gonna click on node 3. I'm gonna change the label. We're gonna adjust contrast here. Now, I'm gonna come down here to contrast and I'm gonna crank it up a little bit. You don't wanna go too over the board with it. I wouldn't go past 1.1 unless you have a really, really flat looking camera, but obviously customized to your heart's extent. So I'm gonna boost that a little bit. I'm gonna move on to the next one. We're gonna make that one the saturation one. I'm gonna come over here to saturation and boost that a little bit. Something worth keeping in mind with contrast and saturation is that the higher contrast and the higher saturation you add to an image, the harder it is to compress. Because that's more information. That's more color information, which at a limited bit rate when you're streaming up to a streaming service at 6 or 8 megabits per second, that's harder to compress. And the more you crank it up, the more you might end up with some super artifacty or, pixelated looking footage because it has too much information to try to compress at a low bit rate. So don't overdo it, even if it looks kind of cool. So we're done with the saturation tab. I'm gonna come over here to the next one. And for this, I don't think it really matters in a LUT, but I do apply a tiny bit of sharpening, clicking the blur sharpen thing here, clicking the second dot for sharpen, and bring that down to 48 for my camera. I wouldn't go past 49 or 48 for most cameras. However, I don't even know if this really applies in the LUT, and you can always add sharpening filter after the fact in OBS Studio. I'll show you that in a little bit. But that's how it is. So then I go ahead and fill in the rest of the labels that I forgot here. So node labels, saturation, and then node label sharpness. Whoa, I hit the wrong button. So we have color graded this footage, but we've not really made a LUT yet. Before we make a LUT, I want us to make a still. A still in Resolve is basically a snapshot that serves both as a screenshot, but also as a basically measurement of all the nodes that you have applied here. All of these nodes will be saved in the still. So I'm gonna right click the preview, click grab still, and then I'm gonna give that a name. So change label, webcam LUT epos. Now, if I delete all of these nodes currently in my little node graph here, I don't know why I have this cursor. Oh, there we go. And now all of my, I have no color grade applied. If I right click this node and hit apply, or the still, and click apply grade, now it's applied back, and I have each of those individual nodes already labeled, already adjusted. This is super important because if you want to, say you make it and then you want to come back and tweak it because it wasn't how you liked, or it just ended up not being exactly what you wanted, you now have the freedom to come back and tweak it with the exact settings you already had without starting from scratch, or without, kind of going back and forth on the same things without knowing what you're really tweaking. This is super, super useful. The problem you'll run into here is that this default stills bin only applies to the current project open. So you'll have to keep track of this project and keep opening the same project, or you won't be able to open the same stills anymore. But that's what this power grade bin is for. Power bins in DaVinci Resolve save persistent across projects. So by dragging your still into this bin, now every project you make and open will have these stills available. So you can see I have a bunch of others that I've made that you can then apply, and you can get different sets of nodes here that you can apply to different cameras. Obviously these are built for different cameras, so they look kind of goofy on here, but you get the idea. So now you can apply this in recording if you didn't apply it in OBS and things like that as well. We still haven't made a LUT yet though. So the first way is how you'll use it for OBS Studio and updated versions of StreamLabs OBS. You come down here to the clips banner, you find your clip that you color graded, right click it, generate 3D LUT, 65 point cube, find a place to name it, we'll call it Epos Tut LUT, and click save. If you need to use it for XSplit Broadcaster or another app that needs a PNG LUT, we'll have to do it a little differently. First and foremost, in your media pool, drag in the original .png file that OBS uses to reference their LUTs. That's available under C, Program Files, OBS Studio, Data, OBS Plugins, OBS Filters, LUTs, original.png. Drag that in, and we're gonna make a new timeline using that selected clip, which you will see needs to be 512 by 512 resolution to match the image. or else you're gonna get some weird thing because it's not gonna scale properly to these cubes here. Now, you find this clip, go back to the gallery, and right click on that LUT, hit apply grade. Now you can see here all of those nodes were applied to this image file, and we can toggle it on and off and see the changes happen. Now to get this, we right click, we go to grab still again. We find that still we just clicked, right click, hit export, change file type to PNG, epos tut LUT, and now you have a PNG LUT of that color grade. And I'll show you how to apply it in your software in a little bit. Now let's flip on over to Adobe Photoshop so I can show you how this works in a photo editing workflow instead. Once you have Photoshop open, first you'll need to grab a screenshot of that sample clip that we've recorded. Both VLC and MPC-HC, my favorite media players, as well as most media players, should give you a screenshot option. So find a point where you're showing your white balance card or your color checker that you want to use as a reference point. This is fine. Go to File, Save Image, and save it as a BMP or a PNG. I prefer PNG, so I went with that. Then you need to drag that exported screenshot into Photoshop to make a new file based on this photo. Now we're gonna rely on the adjustment layers over here to make changes to our image. However, you can also just go up to the image menu and there's a couple options there as well. This won't work magic for everybody, but under image, there is auto tone, auto contrast, and auto color, which can try to give you the best looking image based on what you have sent them. I don't even feel like it made much of a difference here, so I wouldn't worry about it personally, but you can try that if you don't have a good starting point. Now, I will point you to the histogram. It's not the same as the waveform available in Resolve. It's nowhere near as good, but it can help you with exposure levels. It shows that there's a lot of my image over here that's in the darkness. There's not a whole lot that's super clipped other than a couple specific lines, but you know, that's fine. If you don't have that available, window histogram. So we're gonna start adding adjustment layers. So brightness and contrast and levels both can help you with exposure, which is what we're gonna start with first. You can of course mess with white balance, but that's a little trickier because you do need to kind of mess with color balance to get that quite where you'd want it. So you can come over here to midtones and kind of adjust and get where you think your camera should look based on, you know, what your skin tone and your room looks like. That looks pretty good for white balance. I'm gonna leave it at that. We're gonna go to exposure with levels. You move this middle one around and it kind of does the opposite of what you think. So you move it to the left, that makes everything brighter. You move it to the right, it makes everything darker. I'm gonna find a nice little balance here of what I think my image should look like. I'm also gonna use brightness and contrast to also get the image and add a little bit of punch to the image. You don't wanna overdo it on contrast or saturation because the more contrast and the more saturation your image has, the harder it is to compress at low bit rates for streaming because it's literally more information for it to encode with low bit rates. So you don't want to overdo it even if it looks cool. So we've got exposure, we've got contrast. I'm going to click vibrance and adjust vibrance and saturation again to add a little bit of it. But again, don't overdo it. Once we're at a point that we like, you should first save this PSD file as EposLUT test or whatever you want it. That way you have all of these layers available. So anytime you do a new test that you want to tweak, you can just drag in your new screenshot over atop the background image and you have all of these individual layers to mess with so that you can tweak it later. So you can make changes, you can update it, you can improve it over time without starting from scratch or without having it all compiled into one image. You want to save this PSD and then leave it alone because everything we do here moving forward, we're not going to save into the PSD. So next we need to drag in the original.png reference file that OBS uses for LUTs. This is a color square file that has a bunch of settings that OBS looks for the differences in to then apply a LUT to. The same thing is applied to XSplit and StreamLabs OBS as well. So we're gonna take this original.png, we're gonna drag it into our image. This image can be found in C, Program Files, OBS Studio, Data, OBS Plugins, OBS Filters, LUTs. First, go to Image, Image Size, uncheck the link so that it's not sized, you know, evenly. And we're doing 512 by 512. That's the size of the original.png. That's what it needs to be. Drag that in, and then you need to set it over top the background layer underneath all of your adjustment layers. And then you can see here, if you turn them off, you can see the settings start to uncheck. So now we've customized the LUT. So you need to save as, Control-Shift-S, as a PNG, PNG LUT test. And now we have a PNG LUT that'll work in OBS, StreamLabs OBS, and XSplit. You can't really make a cube LUT very easily from Photoshop. That's fine. Do not save back over your original test LUT PSD with the size, or it's gonna be a lot harder to edit your next screenshot moving forward because it'll be all squished and not how you like it. But now you can close it without saving. You already have your PNG LUT, you're ready to go, and you can come back to that PSD whenever you wanna make a new one. Sound good? Next, let's tackle doing this in Adobe Premiere Pro. So here I've made a new Adobe Premiere Pro project, and I've already worked on this because I had to do another take. So ignore everything you see up at the moment. We're gonna be in the editing tab at first. This is probably what it opens up to you. And I'm gonna drag in my test footage, which is that test footage with the gray card that I already recorded. I'm gonna drag that into Premiere. And once it keeps up here, Premiere always seems to have this issue. We're gonna make a new sequence based on that clip. And then we're gonna make a new adjustment layer because we're gonna apply all of our color grading to this adjustment layer. That way we can swap out the test clips that we apply it to and things like that so that we can save our project and keep working on it moving forward should we need to adjust white balance more or improve our LUT here over time. Drag your adjustment layer on the second track above your video clip and then click on over to the color tab. Now we're gonna be using the Lumetri color for this as it's the best way to, well, it's not the best way, but it's a great way to edit color in Premiere. You may notice that compared to the other software I showed, my background is super dark and kind of clipped over here compared to the other things. The kind of format I recorded in is not super Premiere compatible. It doesn't handle formats in a way that I like, but the general rules will apply here, even if my end result doesn't look quite as great as my current camera view does or how it looked in the other software. I'm also using the Lumetri scopes here to get a nice waveform view of my image so that we can get exposure levels and things like that looking nice. If you don't have that, go to Window and Lumetri Scopes, and then click the little gear icon and choose Waveform RGB. Now make sure the adjustment layer is selected before you start editing. First, we're gonna set white balance. Again, ideally this was all set in your camera already, but click the little white balance dropper and come over here to white balance. Just click somewhere in your gray part. I'd avoid using white whenever possible, just use gray. And you'll see again, my camera was set in camera to white balance, so you're not gonna see a major change here. That's fine. We got -2.8 and -3.8, whatever. Next, we're gonna work on exposure. That's using the exposure, highlights, shadows. Thankfully, this is a lot easier to understand than Resolve's controls just by the name. So the highlights are obviously, you know, the super bright points, exposure is the overall brightness, contrast is the punchiness. With the scopes over here, you have a line at 100% at the top and 0 at the bottom. Anything that goes over this 100% line is clipped in the white, which means it is way too bright and there's no information left. So it just looks pure white, like this light that's on the screen or the window in the back there. And then anything too far in the black is clipped in the black and there's no information there. You'll see I have that issue with this clip right now because of the way it was recorded. Like I said, it's not Premiere compatible. The idea is that you don't want most of your footage going over this. You can get your darks kind of close to that 0 line, but definitely don't touch it or go over it or it'll look pretty weird on stream. So go ahead and tweak the controls to kind of get the exposure values where you like. If you do have a color checker chart like this, you can kind of use your lines here to figure out where you want your exposure to be because these work as exposure lines. And so the top bar represented by this little red, green, blue bar here, the middle one's kind of down here, and the black one's kind of lost at this point. But you want the top one to be somewhere around the 80 or 90 range. So I'm actually gonna turn down my exposure just a little bit to get it there and maybe turn down the highlights a bit, get a nice balance between them. I'm aiming for that 90 range, but I want the image to be brighter than it is. So I'll have it touching the 90 bar, even though it's not fully supposed to be there. Shadows, I'm gonna bring up just a little bit, but obviously you can't really see it with this clip. And then your contrast is gonna be your punchiness. So you can crank it all the way up and just have this like super dramatic looking image, but I recommend being a little bit more, you know, moderate with this. And then you can use whites and blacks to help adjust brightness as well. And then you have saturation control too. You can crank that up a little bit, get the colors a little bit more popping like you like. But again, be careful with saturation and contrast. You don't want to overdo it. The more contrasty and the more saturated your video feed is, the harder it is to compress because that's more information that the compressor has to work with a low bitrate if you're streaming to Twitch or YouTube or whatever. So the more contrasty you make it, the harder it will be for it to compress. So even if it looks cool, it'll turn into a pixelated or blocky mess on Twitch the further and further you go. Now you can mess with the creative tab, the curves and whatever, if you know what you're doing with color grading, but otherwise you're fine. And if you're using OBS Studio or an updated copy of StreamLabs OBS, all you need to do is click the 3 bars next to Lumetri color and click export.cube. Save that out and hit save, and you now have a cube LUT that you can import into OBS, StreamLabs OBS, and your video editor. If you're using XSplit Broadcaster, we need a PNG file, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. First though, go ahead and save your project file. That way we have this adjustment layer that you can come back and tweak later. So you need to drag in the original .png file that OBS uses and most XSplit as well uses as a reference for LUTs, which is available in C, Program Files, OBS Studio, Data, OBS Plugins, OBS Filters, LUTs. Original.png, drag it into your bin and right-click it, make a new sequence based on that because it needs to be set to that 512 by 512 resolution to perfectly match the image or your colors will be off. Now click back into your previous sequence, right-click that adjustment layer, copy, and paste that in here. And you want to paste it over top of your PNG file here. So you may need to paste it next to it and then drag it up onto the second track. Now if we show and hide that layer, you can see the color grade being applied to those squares. Once you're good to go, you can now use this export frame option, which if you don't see it here under your preview, click the plus icon and drag it on from the button editor. But click export frame, make sure PNG format is selected and export that out. And now you have a PNG LUT to use in your streaming software. So lastly, let's talk about how to actually use these LUTs within your streaming software. In OBS Studio, find your video capture device option. It should be the lowest level entry of that video capture device. So if you have it nested in like 3 different scenes, you want the original source listing of the device. Or if you have that same source listing added to multiple scenes, you'll have to add that to every existing scene, assuming the filters don't sync across. Your mileage may vary. Right-click the video capture device, hit Filters, add new filter, apply LUT. Navigate to your LUT file that you exported earlier. Now you can add other color grading filters after the fact, to tweak contrast, to maybe punch it up a bit more, to add sharpness or whatever, but I highly recommend doing all of this after you've already applied your LUT. You don't do that before your LUT, do it after it, you'll get the best results. In StreamLabs OBS, once again, find your video capture source, right-click, Filters, add new filter, apply LUT, and find your cube LUT. And again, apply all of your extra filters after the fact. In both of these programs, you have an intensity slider to adjust just how intense it is in case you apply it and it feels over the top. You can tone it down a bit. Custom LUT support is supported in XSplit Broadcaster, but not XSplit Gamecaster. To add the LUT in XSplit Broadcaster, find your webcam capture device in your sources list, right-click it, go to the Effects tab, and then scroll down, there's Custom LUT. And then you browse, and you do have to use the PNG LUT file. You have control over intensity, and it works the same as all the other programs I have shown. And that's it. You learned how to create your own LUT to make your camera look professional and maybe cinematic, or however you wanted it to look. You can tweak it to your heart's desire and do all sorts of crazy looks with it. Make a LUT for your camera to make it look great for your stream. And you're not paying for some crazy Instagram filter pack that isn't gonna make it look how you want. This is how to make it look great for your particular camera. I do hope this video was helpful for you. I do hope you enjoyed it. I do hope it maybe saved you a little bit of money. Come join us on Discord if it did at eposvox.gg/discord. We're not gonna give away these kinds of LUTs, but I do have LUTs for HDR tone mapping and some other cool stuff. We chat about streaming topics and OBS help all the time. We have a nice tech support team and all of that. Join us, eposvox.gg/discord. Check us out on Floatplane for early access to videos and behind the scenes content. If you're interested in my new streaming course, I do have my OBS masterclass linked in the video description. If all of this was foreign language to you and you want to learn OBS, check that out. Otherwise, if you're interested in my new streaming course, streamtheory.gg/sign up, go check it out there. Otherwise, hit the like button, subscribe for more tech education and stream guides. I'm your host. I keep calling myself a host. I've never done that before. I don't know why this is happening now. I'm your stream professor, EposVox. I'll see you next time.